Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pearl's first specialized reading session on the Tamil struggle. My name is Abarna, and I'll be moderating today's reading session. It'll be split into a 40-minute lecture from our guest speaker, followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. Similar to our reading groups, questions can be submitted using the general chat box, which I will then pose to our guest speaker. And if you have any private questions, please feel free to message them directly to myself. Also, due to demand, we will be recording today's session and posting it onto our YouTube page. If you would not like to be featured, please feel free to turn your camera off. Our topic today will be the intersection of gender and militancy in the Tamil struggle. And joining us today will be guest speaker, Dr. Nimmi Gowrinathan. Dr. Nimmi Gowrinathan is a writer, a scholar, and an activist. She's a professor at the City College of New York, where she founded the Politics of Sexual Violence Initiative, a global initiative that draws on in-depth research to inform movement building around the impact of sexual violence on women's political identities. As a key part of this initiative, Dr. Gowrinathan created Beyond Identity, a gendered platform for scholar activists, a program that seeks to train immigrants and students of color in identity-driven research, political writing, and activism anchored in a thoughtful analysis of structural violence. She's also currently a senior scholar at the Center for Political Conflict, Gender, and People's Rights at the University of California, Berkeley. She provides expert analysis to CNN, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, and the BBC, and has been published in Harper's Magazine, Freeman's Journal, and Guerrilla magazine, among others. Dr. Gowrinathan is the creator of the Female Fighter series at Guerrilla magazine and the publisher of Adi, a new literary journal to rehumanize policy. Her work and writings can be found at babyarchy.com, and her forthcoming book, Radicalizing Her, examines the complex politics of the female fighter. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Gowrinathan.
So I was just saying, I know that what it takes in this moment right now, the kind of additional emotional reserves to pull yourselves to a screen for political education. So that tells me that many of you are activists, which for me is very exciting. There was maybe 3 or 4 of us that I knew of when I was beginning to look into my own identity. So this is a really beautiful thing to see. Most of you know this, but Tamil women in Sri Lanka participated in both nonviolent and armed forms of resistance. And my work has been to understand the complex politics of each of these women and why some chose violence. I have spent a lot of time in Sri Lanka. I speak decent Tamil, but I do not often indulge in the politics of authenticity. I don't believe that we are a struggle that can afford to limit its ranks, nor that one should indulge in a kind of exclusionary politics in movement building. I want to start with an excerpt from my upcoming book. It's the first time, or one of the first times that I'm reading from the book. It's called Radicalizing Her. I'll start with a short excerpt. She is no longer a tiger, taken captive by the Sri Lankan government at the end of the war. She is an ex-combatant. For her and other women like her, detention is a halfway house for those nearly dead but counted among the living. A government psychologist is among her only visitor. How angry are you now, he asks in broken Tamil. Do you feel angry enough to throw a glass? She considers the question. Having been trained in combat, she knows that a glass thrown must be aimed at a target. But where to direct that rage? At the guerrilla men with whom she shared a battlefield, who now refused her hand in marriage. At the soldiers who left her wishing she joined her friends in a mass grave. At the NGO-funded rehabilitation teacher who places reams of fabric before her, demanding she stitch tiny yellow ducks. At him, the government-paid neutral psychologist. He is waiting for her answer to assess her level of madness, not the source of her rage. So in my work, where the choice to participate in violence for women is seen as extreme, right? For a woman to be a fighter is something considered very extreme. I understand it as the violence that led her to the battlefield is the normalized violence of the everyday. The rape that pushes her away from society, the marriage that traps her within it, the military occupation that intrudes on her every movement, and the peaceful savior who seeks to extract her voice from the body it inhabits. First, strategically, I think we must understand the view of the female fighter, and for me that's predominantly women in the Tigers, though I have worked with other fighters, from the outside. I've heard female combatants described as monsters, antisocial, deviants, or simply criminals. Their motivations reduced to a matter of who they bump into or what brightly colored visuals they find online. Second, particularly in this space, we must understand her positioning inside community, inside family, inside culture, in order to reimagine a more dynamic resistance that challenges both of these. So first, from the outside, the view of this female fighter from the outside, what I most often hear is that she's been manipulated, brainwashed into joining a movement, right? We exist in a feminist world where they're constantly concerned with the question of erasure and the invisibility of women, no. But for me, the inability to see women's politics is not only dangerous, it is anti-feminist, right? Most often what we see with this woman is that we read the politics through the men around her. She joined because of a boyfriend, a husband, a cousin, or she was forced to, no. Rather than antisocial elements, which is what we often see the female fighter as described, I argue that the fighter mimics the violence of the state and other forces. She is actually a product of the society that puts her in this position. There is, you hear often a language also around the female fighter, right? This passive construction versus her active reality, right? You'll hear that she is vulnerable rather than what made her vulnerable. You'll hear that she is alienated rather than looking at the structural alienation of this woman. You have this apolitical blank slate, that these women are simply out there, they're untethered politically, right? They can be pulled by anything, by social media, rather than being students of injustice, which is what I have found over the years. Recently, it was pointed out to me by my editors or by editors in publishing in America that not everybody thinks about the female fighter as much as I do. I think that may be true, but I really believe that the study of the female fighter has much broader implications for how we see gender and violence, right? The second problem from the outside is positioning, right? The problem of construction. I tell my students often that one has to think about how this woman is constructed by the outside in order to understand how then they deconstruct her, right? If you've read Monsters and Women, they create the monster that they want to destroy, right? How do they create this monster? Part of the problem is the female fighter is often from one of these marginalized communities in the third world, right? So she very easily, to the white outside, becomes the victim, right? She falls into that category. So first she's constructed as a victim. There's a paper that my colleagues and I, one of whom may be on this call today, called Emissaries of Empowerment. And in this paper, we trace back this narrative of a marginalized woman to the colonial period, when white women were called to intervene to save women in uncivilized nations, right? There's actually a publication in the English Women's Review where Native women in colonies such as India were cast as special and deserving objects of feminist concern. What this does today is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, you see these contemporary iterations of this approach, right? The media adulation of a white woman's personal journey into the heart of darkness, alongside an image of a Congolese woman as sexualized, brutalized, and powerless, right? So defining this woman through her trauma serves two key purposes for the outside. Interventions into her life can be seen as a moral obligation, right? We had to out of morality. And second, a sexualized victim is not a political actor, right? If you see someone as a sexualized victim, you do not expect political action from them. So when she's constructed in this way, she's already had the politics taken away from her, no? And the moral obligation is particularly important when the West intervenes in other countries on the basis of morality. If I challenge a white woman, let's say Eve Ensler, on her work in the third world, then what I'm not saying is, you're a bad person, right? I'm not challenging, I'm not able to talk about her politics because that conversation has been shut down because she's saying, I'm going in because I'm a good person. So I have to help these women. There's no politics there. So I can't have a conversation with her beyond good and bad. So most of you have heard the term empowerment. Today, the term is really sort of omnipresent in the West and Western aid organizations. And of course, we've heard it in Sri Lanka many times over the years in the Tamil community. Most people don't know that the word started in the 1970s from a group of feminists from the global South, from Brazil, from Southern India, from Mexico, right? They met in India, and these were women who were intimately familiar with the conditions of women's oppression. And they centered their conversation on the political forces responsible for it, right? They emerged from this history of women who were armed and active, who fought against colonial interests and cultural oppression, right? So here again, the outside and inside fight, right? That was being done back in the 1970s at the same time. For them, the term empowerment was the foundation of an explicitly political project, which was intended to incite mobilization. So now we have 50 years later, empowerment programming for women like Tamil women, ranging from indigenous women in Bolivia crocheting string bikinis to allow white women to shop with a purpose, to ex-combatants in Sri Lanka being offered training in icing cakes and hairstyling and sewing classes. How did this happen, right? To me, my work has continually revealed amongst female fighters in war zones that this approach to women in the global South denied women their distinctive politics and their desires for political power, right? I myself personally, as an aid worker, have spent years handing out across the Northeast chickens and cows for rape victims, beauty school training for former combatants, and sewing machines for really any sad woman anywhere. So what initiated in the global South as a political project has now become this linchpin of anti-politics, right? And so for me, it's really important to look at the underlying feminist ideology, right? Aid is not just neo-colonial, there is a white feminism that keeps this in place, right? For women in particular, through this empowerment, through this vision of her, this construction as the victim, power has been delinked from politics. That's what the term empowerment has done. Right? It's taken the politics away. So if you're specifically talking about the female fighter, she enters into this conversation now in the policy world in countering violent extremism. This is a new field, countering violent extremism, to understand how to stop this threat, where women are not looked at to be understood, they're looked at to be seen as a threat to the West. So for me, when I look at the female fighter, this highly politicized woman, right, on the battlefield, the disconnect is the clearest in this empowerment conversation, right? When I'm handing a sewing machine to a woman who was the head of a battle in Elephant Pass, you know? So the female fighter is the latest example of the victim in the global South. Another beneficiary is seen through the Western Feminist Project, alongside rape victims, war widows, mothers of the disappeared, ex-combatants. They have an identity that's been reduced to this simple story of abject victimhood. Right? One of the former Tiger commanders in detention told me, sewing is of no use to me, but only when I finish the course would they say that I am de-radicalized. Right? Last year I was in Colombia, in Bogota, with a senior combatant from the FARC, which is a Marxist guerrilla movement in the country. And of course, as the peace process began, the interveners came to visit her and the other ex-combatants, and they came to de-radicalize and offer her a project for ex-combatant livelihood, and they offered her sewing machines. So she explains, I told them no back then. Today, these groups continue to apply for funds in our name to do these types of projects. It's not what we, the fighters, want. She fears that these programs are partially responsible for active female FARC members slowly losing their politics. Right? Female fighters see the goal of these programs very clearly, to push them away from political life into gender-appropriate roles. Right? So if we shift our view, I think that people have read Captive. Captive for me is shifting from the outside to the inside, right? So if we wanted to see women in their entirety, in their political complexity, right? To see women in these complex, violent ways still requires accessing a type of like other world or fantasy. That's why this piece came out the way that it did, right? that she isn't this one-dimensional depiction of a superhero, a Malala or Wonder Woman, right? There's no room for her in this political reality, right? She's neither, for feminists, a victim to be saved, nor a political agent to be supported. This is really important to understand the positioning of the female fighter. She fits into neither category, right, because of her complexity. So Captive began actually with a conversation just outside of Stockholm when a group of graduate students at a university there told me that my theories on the female fighters were simply the Stockholm syndrome, right? That these women had just been tricked into supporting their abusers. So the piece really is about looking for women's power in their stories. Most often we look to the beginning, right? If she had no choice in her captivity, she had no power, right? Feminists in particular will celebrate power if in the ending she's free, free from an abusive husband or free from an individual context. The middle is sort of skipped over, right? For me, most of the women that I met in my early research, some of them joined voluntarily, and some of them were coerced into the movement, right? So what happened to the ones who were coerced is suddenly in my head, it was like, okay, well, if they were coerced into the movement, then there's no point asking them what their politics are, right? But what happens is there's this moment where there is that light switch. No, you've turned off her power because of this one moment, right? So the movement is in the middle. It is in the middle where women navigate the circumstances they were given and those they create. There is political potential on the inside, right? No woman is ever entirely free, but inside captivity, there's still action, there's still movement, there's still politics for these women. The idea of culture, and I think in this space is very, very important, that the female fighter, all women, all of the women on this call for sure, exist inside these concentric circles, no? There's the woman, and then there's the family, the community, the culture, the state, right? Each of them is repressive in their own way, right? So one of the easiest things that feminists will use is the idea of culture. So the United Nations now says that culture is the transformative change, right? That's what we should be doing, is changing cultures for women, right? Culture is a very useful perpetrator because it leaves nobody accountable, right? You can say this is just culture, this is their culture, how they treat women. This is their culture, how men behave, right? So then the state is not responsible, the NGOs are not responsible, nobody is responsible. Culture is this static thing that's there and nobody can change it really, right? But culture is not static. Culture moves to fit around context, right? When I was working in Afghanistan, there was this idea that women were not going to school, girls were not going to school because their fathers wouldn't let them. No, they were not going to school because there was a US military checkpoint on the road on the way to school. So their fathers did not want them to be harassed at the military checkpoint, right? That's the context around it. And it's the context that outside actors can fix. They cannot come into our communities and meddle with culture, right? What they can change is the context, right? The rise of alcoholism in the Northeast right now, that is not culture. That did not exist before the end of the war. The culture has now wrapped around a context where you have a bunch of men living in a highly militarized, occupied territory, right? So culture then becomes the work of us, right? It is inside the movement that work has to happen, right? It's not for outside forces to engage in. And that is a particularly, it's a complex question for us to engage in. I think at this moment right now, of course, a lot of my students in Harlem are protesting. There's a lot happening in the US and everywhere, really. But it's an important moment, I think, as we think about the work to be done inside, to distinguish between political work and performative politics, right? And it's not a major point that I want to make, but I also do want to put it out there, right? That I've seen a lot of my students get trapped in this sort of, again, the trap of authenticity, right? I have to be on the front lines. I have to be protesting because this is the authentic political work, right? Many of my students are undocumented, or they have parents at home that they're caring for who are very, very ill and could get the coronavirus. This is not the time for them to be on the front lines, right? But they've created this hierarchy of what is authentic and what is not authentic political work. Most of what we see publicly is a performative politics. Performative politics is not real politics, right? We had a meeting there was a grant makers meeting in Puerto Rico, and all of these donors gathered to talk about, how they could save girls of color. And I gave a lecture in this space, and they said, well, don't you think that you're preaching to the choir? And it bothered me, because then that means that I'm like you, if we're a choir, But the more important point is that a choir is a performance, right? A choir is a performance that can be done once you learn the words. And these people have learned the words: capacity building and empowerment and sustainable and community driven. So yes, they are absolutely a chorus, right? But that's not what political work should look like. If you were doing real political work, you would not all agree with each other. It would not be a chorus, right? So it's sort of, I'm making an argument here away from performative politics to a space that allows a kind of dissent internally in our own ranks, inside this community. I want to talk a little bit about identity, because this is a moment of identity politics, and it's a lot of my work right now in Harlem. For me, people have asked if the focus of my work is a pushback to mainstream institutions. And I've worked enough with the UN, State Department, human rights groups, the academy to know that the process of pushing back against rigid institutions is futile. They cannot accept change, So pushback to me is sort of, beating my head against a wall. I see my work as to expand the political imagination of the resistance, because there is so much room there, so much that can be absorbed, particularly by some of the younger folks who have joined us today. And so when you come to this question of identity, yes, your identity is shaped by birth, but it's also shaped by your lived experience, right? Lived experience creates an identity, experiences with violence. So when there was a Black scholar here, Kimberly Crenshaw, she asked me to join a town hall on the impact of police violence on Black and brown women in the United States. And I said no at first, because I thought, well, I've spent all of my time, working on the question of Tamil women in Sri Lanka. I had immersed myself in the specific conditions of violence for Tamil women. But as I thought about it, the connective tissue between a Black woman stopped by the police in the Bronx and Tamil women in refugee camp became increasingly clear, right? That state violence maps onto women's bodies in the exact same way, eliciting fear, revealing physical vulnerability, and inciting rage, right? So the question is, can you go deep enough into your own identity to find the political through lines with other struggles? Okay? And this cannot be done in the hashtag, right? That this is work that happens over years and years. So in Sri Lanka, you have Tamil women wiping off red pottus on their forehead before they enter a military checkpoint, right? Hoping to be disassociated from themselves. In Harlem, my students remove headscarves as they descend into the subway. My son's public school has banned hoodies. So whether it's a hijab or a hoodie or a puttu, the state is asking our communities to sacrifice identity for security, right? And so as we build this political consciousness as marginalized women, you have to first understand the conditions of your mind's captivity, right? Like we were talking about before, it's the task of power and the state to categorize and control. They create these categories of victim, minority, war widow, beneficiaries. The problem for me was watching this then be reproduced in the resistance. Identity politics, as it was lived out online, created these smaller and smaller boxes of belonging, right? I remember once speaking to a national conference of activists, and they brought up MIA and what had happened in London when she was not allowed to perform at a Black music festival. And, you know, they were pushing and pushing and pushing and saying, well, she didn't mention Black refugees. No, she didn't. Okay. No, so then nobody is Black enough, nobody is Muslim enough, nobody is Tamil enough, nobody's queer enough to be a part of your struggle. You make these smaller and smaller boxes of belonging, those boxes are too fractured to challenge something as big as the state. No, you have to find a way to connect these struggles. So for me, like the female fighter, our solidarity begins not with our gender, but a collective desire to resist the violence of the state, right? This is the deep political work I believe that has to be done. There's no hashtag campaign, no chickens, no sewing machines. No, it's political work. I'll just sort of, I've talked about violence a little bit, but I want to, particularly for the women here, that's useful, is to understand the role of violence in politics. For me, violence is what connects all of us. It is the political thread, right? But first, it has to be extracted from the moral imperative to condemn it, right? When you talk about the resistance, when you talk about a violent resistance, you're pushed into this position of you have to condone or condemn it, right? Neither is useful politically. Violence is a reality in the lives of the women I know. That's it, it's a reality. Whether I condone or condemn it makes no difference to their lives, right? So our role then is to understand violence. Why did they choose violence, right? To understand the intimate inner workings of violence. So if we understand violence as a political act that disproportionately affects women, then we're able to see that it also has a political tool. It has a political impact, right? People have been able to say now rape is a political act. Okay, if it's a political act, then it has a political impact, right? I think of rape often, and this is inside the community and outside the community, as this thing called fulgurate, right? When lightning hits the sand, it creates this petrified lightning, right? This distinctive glassy shape. And I think of that moment of a rape for a woman as this distinctive shape that forms inside of her, right? No two of these are the same. It's sort of sharp edges and it's, a very deep wound, but it creates a political identity also. And that's what we're missing, no? There was a female fighter once a commander who told me I was vulnerable to rape because I was a woman, but I was targeted because I was Tamil. So she reflects on her role as a combatant and says, this act, the rape, is no longer what defines me. For the female fighter, mobilizing centers on political oppression, not on trauma. Okay? So I just want to end with a way to think about finding your own role in the struggle, right? Where is your place in the Tamil struggle? And the idea of political education, I think what Pearl has been doing is an incredible project. When I was in London recently, I had the chance to sit with Adele Balasingham, who many of you know, but was married to Anton Balasingham and one of the early women who trained women in the Tigers. And with Adele and with the other folks that I met there, they would talk about what political education was like in London. Right? That back then, Bala would sit in this small apartment in London and he would have people just coming through and they would sit on the floor and somebody would cook, right? But the people coming through were not just Tamil. There was the Eritreans who came through, the Palestinians. There were, Libyan fighters, Sudanese fighters who had come through, right? Political education was as natural as solidarity was. They were just engaged. The way Adele Auntie described it was simply that this was a family, right? This is, in an interview with MIA also, she said, for all of us who think about this from the outside, she sees Tamil women in Sri Lanka who made moves thinking not about themselves as individuals, but as a community. They made decisions thinking about others, right? So the female fighter also, the collective comes before the individual. How do we get back to that space where political organizing becomes natural in that way, right? So thinking about what your place is in the struggle, is it as a writer, is it as an artist, as an intellectual, as an organizer? There is no one place in the struggle. I think in thinking about the history of the struggle, it helps you figure out how you situate yourself, right? Because there are these moments like 2009 that feel overwhelming, it feels like the struggle is over. But then when you go backwards and look at the history of the struggle, you're able to see that this is one moment in a very long struggle that will continue well after us, right? Perhaps even in my son's generation, right? There was a moment recently, or last year, 2 years ago, when I defended one of the Tamil rehabilitation organizing heads in London for asylum. It's an NGO that worked with the Tigers. And I had to defend him against these 5 white judges, you know, who very much wanted to deport him and prove that he was a terrorist. And I argued and argued, no, on the basis that the Tigers had a state and this was an NGO working with the state. And after it was over and Reggie got asylum, he sent me a note that said, Tanguchi, you spoke like a true frontline fighter. And to me it was, no, so then this is my role in the struggle. Maybe I'm not the one who's going to be organizing protests, maybe I'm not going to be, but it helped me to see what my role in the struggle was, right? So the question is, how do you access our history? And this is something I've been thinking about a lot, along with Mario and others, in a new archive project that we're doing. And I'll just read a short excerpt about the archive, because I think, you know, there's 2 ways that I think about accessing history. It's through materials and it's through memories, right? And they're both complex in their own way. But this is a short excerpt about the archive. One evening in New York, this is from the book as well, 2 Tamil uncles transfer history from a basement in New Jersey to my apartment. A trolley helps bear the weight and the deposit is made. We go out for Thai food. Tamils love Thai food. When I return, the boxes spill over, occupying the small space I worked hard to eke out for myself and my son. They tempt me in the mornings and taunt me before bed. They threaten to overwhelm me. Stuffed in between the VHS Tiger recruitment videos are bent photos of Tamil women in bell-bottoms protesting outside the White House. Hidden in the pages of speeches is a stenciled artwork of a female fighter. Binders are overfull of letters, appeals to humanity signed by long-dead dignitaries. Tissue paper-thin political pamphlets calling for revolution that once circulated lays still. I feel the acute burden of materials that are both meaningful and without concerted effort meaningless. I am drawn to the markings of and about Tamil women in this historical content. Running through these boxes was also a disturbing, consistent tension as Tamil men grapple with the problematic positioning of the Tamil woman. As the perceptions of her political potential in society began to shift, an elderly political supporter of the Tigers writes, how the Tamil woman, who was a docile, meek, peace-loving member of the Tamil society, turned out to be such a courageous, bold, and sacrificing person, offering herself to fight injustice and to save the Tamil nation, is really unbelievable, but it's true. And finally, I think the question of memory. To me, memory is the disappeared in service of reconciliation at this moment. The erasure of violence, sentiments I hear like rape is no longer a problem in the North and East, occludes this inescapable reality that the moment of violence makes an indelible impact. It's already there. Traumas commit themselves to memory without consent. When I ask Tamil women to remember, I know that they are not re-traumatized. A trauma that never subsided cannot reemerge. So for the first time among the boxes is when I felt at ease asking questions. I think the moments that are harder to locate, the memories to take note of as politically relevant, are the everyday memories, right? Interwoven into the lives of Tamil women, the relentless moments of violence that left these marks. It's around these moments and the materials that recall them that their own politics crystallized, right? And sort of hardened very quickly. A mother who holds the new shoes of her son, who never got to wear them before he was disappeared. His bike that became the gravestone she worshipped in absence of a body. One mother of the disappeared speaking to me in 2017 says her son was late coming home from school one day in 2008. She hasn't seen him since then. She says, if he's dead, okay, tell me. If he's alive, please tell me. His case was dismissed in 2010, but for Asha, she will never move past 2008, past that moment. So if we're handed this compilation of materials and moments, our generation, the task then is to organize, you know? So as I create these smaller boxes within larger ones to hold history, They're boxes with vague categories, Diaspora, you know, Tiger Publications, Resistance, to create some structure inside the resistance. But they're porous enough to allow for the overlapping contested politics of Tamil women. The mothers of the disappeared do not all have the same politics. There are nuanced strands of nationalism that run between them, but do not divide them. So I'll end by saying that I do this work to hand these materials, to leave a body of work over to many of you. And I'll end with a quote from Thammalini, who was passed away a few years ago and was one of the leaders of the movement, from her recent memoir. When I wore the camouflage uniform and walked into town with the gun, there was some respect in the way everyone looked at me. People thought of me and treated me as their own child because I was fighting for them. Now I go into town, no gun, no good clothes to wear. People turn their faces away when they see me, or they sneer at me. Like a forged coin, I have no value. We female fighters dreamed of bending the sky to a bow once. Now all our memories are dissolved and we lie fallen at the threshold of reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gowrinathan. As a Tamil woman myself, listening to you speak was absolutely amazing, and I don't feel like I've ever heard a better synthesis of understanding how violence maps itself onto women's bodies through a theoretical lens, and having it focus on memory in the way that you did. And I think that it informs a lot of our work as young activists and as people that are entering this space with painful intergenerational trauma and with an understanding of existing academic work like yours. We did have 2 questions submitted while you were speaking, and the first one was submitted by Siva, and it was asking if you can suggest specific ways where parents can inspire their youth to participate in advocacy instead of just career and charity.
I'm not a huge fan of advocacy. Of engagement, you know, advocacy has a role. I think the question is, how do you raise your children to be political actors, and to be conscious of their political work? Because the reality is, you know, my son is being raised here in the Bronx, right? So much of his struggle is going to look very different than it was for our parents. But it's very important to me and to his father that he have a cohesive politics, right? That he understand. I've written a recent piece that'll come out in 2 weeks about what this moment has been like for him, because the reality is I'm raising a dark-skinned, who will be big, young man in America. And so we have to have intense conversations about the police, about state violence, about what it looks like, so that he's cautious of that, right? But he's also from a young age been able to connect that to what happened in Sri Lanka, right? One of the things I would say is that we were very open with him about our political work, right, from the outset. And I don't think there's a manual, for how you raise your children to be political. For me, they're quite young. So what I can say is that when you raise your children to be able to see the world as bigger around them, when you raise them to see a continuity between struggles and oppressed peoples around the world, right, then what form that expression takes when your children grow up. They could be a doctor who's politically active, I hope not, but they could be, academics, they could be whatever, but you're hoping that they hold on to that sense of political consciousness, right? For me, the approach has been, because they are children, has been to mark the moments of violence in my son's life, just to mark that for him, right? So when something happens at school, when somebody says something to him that's racist, he's 4, 5, 6 years old, simply to mark it and to say, I think in a way that our parents were unable to, that this was racist, what happened to you. That experience was racist, right? And over time, in his own head, those moments will create their own narrative, right? But it's not to spend 2 hours at 6 years old explaining to him, no, that this child is awful for saying this to you. So I think, yeah, the question is not as much about engaging in advocacy, but how do you encourage your children to play a role in whatever oppression they see around them?
Thank you so much. I think that is incredibly important in terms of understanding how they can build a narrative inside of themselves and not necessarily be turning to their parents in terms of understanding how their role fits into the struggle, but developing it as they learn and as they grow as children as well. In that line, the second question was, since there's many books on the Tamil struggle, would you recommend any top 3 that parents can pass on to their children?
I suppose I would actually give that question to Mario. I think Mario would know a little bit better. He's been spending many of his days reading all of the books that exist ever. Zambi, you want to answer that?
Yeah, we actually made a list that is online. And if you don't have it, I don't know how we're going to do this with sharing kind of the resources that we shared with the previous cohort of the study group. But yeah, there's definitely top 3 in there. I think just in general, it depends on what you want from it, but just in general, from a knowledge perspective, I think Madhurika Rasaratnam's book, Tamils in the Nation, is a quite detailed and kind of still concise but comprehensive account of what happened. Sivaram's biography by Mark Whitaker is another one that I'd definitely recommend. But yeah, we can maybe share that the book list in public with everyone who participated, and if you're registered, we have your email address. So Tamils in the Nation. Yeah, we'll type in the name in the chat box too.
This is, as we put together these lists, it's always very glaring how few Tamil women there are on these lists. So this is my plug to any woman out there who's a writer to sort of contribute to this canon for the next generation. Now, in the magazine and we're doing a lot of work to try and publish new Tamil writers. You know, I really do think that this is part of the legacy that we leave is the writing, right? So if there are writers out there, please get in touch with me, and I would love to support so that, you know, 10 years from now is a very different list than there is now.
Thank you so much. Another question we had was on patriarchy and caste discrimination on Tamil women fighters before the war, during the war, and now after the war in the North and the East. Would you be able to expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the early comments that came back on my work on the female fighter was that, you know, from a lot of big feminists, that I was not considering that the Tigers were anti-feminist, right? And what was being used was this idea that patriarchy then becomes this way that we find this like global struggle between women, right? For me, I was not going to judge these fighters on the basis of a fight that they didn't sign up to. If you met any of the fighters at that time, not one would have told you this is for women's rights, right? The reality is for the female fighter is that each of us, every woman has these multiple identities every day, right? You're a mother, you're Tamil, you're Christian, you're all of these things, right? Any woman, any person is going to fight along the identity lines that are under threat, right? So is it awesome to be a Tamil woman all the time? No, it's conservative, there are cultural rules, right? But you, at that time, particularly, we're not gonna die on the basis that you were a woman or that you were a Sunni, right? You're going to die on the basis that you're Tamil. So if you're going to fight, you're gonna fight along the identity line that's under threat, right? So to judge them on the basis of feminism was patently unfair, in my opinion, you know, from the feminist perspective. Does that mean that patriarchy doesn't exist? No. No, but what happens is that scholars like myself and my Pakistani friends and Muslim friends are constantly put in this position where one has to sort of navigate critiquing your culture without giving an in to the outside to tear down the cause using your culture, right? And it's a very tricky balance one has to, because you're not saying there's not issues inside our community. Absolutely, there are, right? Tamil, dealing with Tamil men, Tamil politicians is the most sexist space I've ever existed in ever, right? Most of the time, you know, I've set up meetings for them at the White House, and then they'll only talk to Thambi and they won't look at me, right? I understand that patriarchy is there, patriarchy is a problem. As did the female fighters. I think one of the really beautiful things is now we no longer have to translate female fighters on the outside because their writing is coming out, right? So Thamilini's own words coming out, she has a very deep critique of patriarchy. So it's not as if women on the inside are not challenging patriarchy. I know for a fact there are young Tamil women, you know, inside Toronto, inside other spaces, who are challenging patriarchy on the outside. But that doesn't detract from the fact that the cause of political oppression, they still uphold to be the state, you know? So I think constantly finding that balance, if you look through the archival materials that we've collected, there's a lot of really patriarchal stuff in there, you know? But, and it still emerges. I mean, we still see it in organizing spaces that are predominantly male. We still see it, you know, over and over again. And that's our work to challenge, right? The caste question as well. Again, you're put in this sort of, what particularly I've seen Sinhalese scholars do is to dismantle the LTT or dismantle any of the resistance movements by finding these sort of fracture points inside a society. Yes, of course, caste is a problem. Yes, of course, patriarchy is a problem. But they were not conversations happening on the inside. They were conversations that were happening, that are still happening on the inside, right, of nationalism. And so our role then is to be able to defend the movement from these kinds of outside challenges, right, that assume that we don't have these conversations. You know, this idea that this is part of the problem of extracting a single voice. We uplift a voice of a Tamil woman. Nobody needs you to uplift her voice. What you need to do is listen to the conversations being had, because those are difficult, complex conversations already happening on the ground, but they are internal ones, right? And I would say in that area, in both areas, of course, the Tamil community has a lot of work to do. But I think some of our younger scholars on the call doing works on new forms of nationalism, this is where these questions are going to come out now in this generation.
Thank you. I think that was very important to inform younger female scholars as well, to understand just how to perceive our notions of patriarchy within the culture, and how to also understand that there is a difference between culture and context. And yeah, thank you so much for expanding on that. On a topic that you had touched on in your answer, we also received a question on it. It was on ensuring safety for women in diaspora organizing spaces as well. Because the question that was posed stated that there is work that we need to do in the diaspora to ensure that women continue to feel safe within organizational spaces. Women are constantly fighting to ensure that we can ensure safe spaces are created and that organizations are held accountable to ensure them. What can we do to make sure that organizational leadership is held accountable within these spaces, and from your experience?
Yeah, it's a different space for me because I was never part of an organization that was led by Tamil youth. You know, like my education happened largely with the uncles. And I was given a lot of respect, I will say, by most of the uncles. But I do see now that there's a different organizing space that's happening. I think here again goes back maybe to the question of political education, right? That this is not the first time that women have tried to organize and maintain a sense of safety and dignity and space inside movements, right? This conversation happened in the Black Panthers. There's long conversations, long things written in the US by the Black Panthers, you know, who actually were in communication with the Tigers, right? There was a meeting in the 80s, right? And some of these things I just sort of marked to be able, for folks to be able to be conscious that one need not sort of put all of their political energy into reinventing strategies that have existed for a very long time, you know? There was a meeting in the 80s in Philippines, which I would love to get more information on, but where all of the movements met, the Tigers, the Sudanese Palestinians. And there was a separate conference there of female fighters only who spoke about ways to engage with their movements, who spoke about strategies of engaging some of the issues facing women specifically, about children on the battlefield, etc. If you're in, London or Toronto or whatever, there's going to be gender organizations who have sorted through a lot of this, probably the Indigenous organizations, Black women's organizations, who have sorted ways to have this kind of safe space. For me, I've always found it most effective, particularly in the Tamil community, of organizing first as women, and not assuming that this was a space that was going to talk about women, but one that was an overtly political space, right? I think that we tried to do that maybe 10 years ago with some of the aunties in the US, and for me, it was really fascinating. I got to meet separately with all of these aunties across the country in little groups, and there was funny moments where, the uncles would try and serve the food and they didn't know where the spoon was and everything, but in these conversations, I found that these aunties had very different politics than their husbands. They didn't always ally with what they believed, right? But they didn't fully know how to express it. And I think the reason that didn't go very far was it just was too difficult to break the cultural barrier, right? This generation, I think it can be done. I think that by organizing separately first and having those difficult conversations about what do we put forward as a collective platform, right? What do we put forward? And it need not be what do we put forward for Tamil women, what do we put forward as a collective political platform, right? Then the allies who are men will find you, right? And my experience has been, particularly organizing in the West, the women's groups who will get the attention, who will get the media, who will get the funding. So strategically, sort of instrumentally, practically, I would organize first as women.
Thank you. I think some of the questions that young activists have been struggling to answer is how to exactly have those conversations. And you touched a bit on this in the beginning of your presentation, where we were talking about like the prevalence of hashtags and having these conversations online. We received a question on performative activism, and it stated, do you believe in the power of performance and the performative to mobilize action? They were wondering in the context of social media and the discussions that we're having in that realm.
Yeah, I think social media plays a role. It is absolutely a mobilizing tool, right? But the problem is that many of these discussions are nuanced conversations. And from my experience, I'm not a big social media person, but social media is where nuance goes to die. There's no ability to have a nuanced conversation there. My fear, particularly for younger activists like my students, is that what happens is you have this moment, right? And something disturbs you, something makes you angry, right? Something in Sri Lanka, something here, and something makes you angry. And then you immediately erect this political platform online. This is my position, right? That comes directly from the emotive reaction, right? As opposed to sitting with that, right? If you sit with that feeling and you eventually sort of marry it with critical thinking, then what you're putting forward is an actual real political platform. Because what's erected in that moment can be very easily broken down because it's not erected on top of anything, right? You've just sort of put that out there. And then the kind of toxic nature of this also I've seen over and over again create a political paralysis for young people, right? Because the blowback all of a sudden of everything, of everybody's reaction, of everything, they just stop saying anything, they stop engaging, they stop writing. Right. And so that also can be very difficult. It's not, either or. I think with some of these platforms, it's where you position it in terms of your form of political expression, right? It may not always be the most effective way to push for political change. It can certainly mobilize folks. I think meetings like this now are mobilized on social media, but it's not necessarily the space for conversations, right? And I fear that what happens is now, particularly with the COVID crisis, we were talking about with some other professors, is that Twitter has become public space, right? But organizing used to happen in public space. Organizing happened from the energy we had in classrooms, from panels, from workshops, from Tamil conferences, right? when we went to Ontario for that Tamil conference recently, or a year and a half ago, there was a kind of energy there, right? And that has now been sort of taken away from us, so that public space feels like it's Twitter. That's what it is. There's nothing else to it. And I think that's really dangerous. I don't think that will last forever. I hope it doesn't last forever. But just to be cautious again, that now social media is playing an even more intense role in defining some of these things. The problem with performative politics is that they're flimsy, right? They can be broken down very quickly, and we're not a movement that has 10 million people marching on the streets for us, So we can't really afford to put forward flimsy platforms. The onus is on all of us to do the work to put up something that can withstand the pressure that will come back. And social media usually cannot do that.
Definitely. I think that it's powerful to speak of the importance of mobilizing outside of social media and understanding your history and seeing that change evolve into what it is during COVID. And noticing your fears and sharing them with us in this space serves as an understanding and a warning for organizers that are looking to create spaces with social media and beyond it as well. Thank you. We also received a question on your discussion of identity politics. This is a bit specific, but the individual mentioned that in terms of identity politics, do you think that categories such as politically Black, in quotation marks, used in the UK for Black and Asians historically are more helpful than harmful? There's been a lot of criticism of using this in today's climate, given how different Black British and British Asian experiences are, but the collective is more important in the mobilization. Do you believe that this is in regardless of the differences that it flattens out?
I hadn't heard the term politically Black. Yeah, I mean, we've been thinking about this a lot right now. There's a piece that I wrote, this one about my son that was ostensibly pegged to Juneteenth, to the end of slavery in the United States. And there's been this sort of, only Black people can talk now, only Black people have the platform. And, Mina Kandasamy, a good friend who I think is on maybe, also, has faced a kind of pushback to talking about publishing Paid Me not being Black and whether she had a right to say anything in that moment, right? I think, anytime you choose to overtly articulate something, I am an intersectional feminist, I am politically Black, I am an ally, etc. You're setting yourself up to be attacked, because nobody can be authentically any of these things, right? But also when you claim that space, it actually means that you're relying on that for credibility as opposed to your work. And so I think that, the Black allies that I work with, it's a problem in the United States as well, for sure. The women of my generation who I am very close to, whether they're Black or white or, we've never said the word allyship. We've never talked about any of these things. It just became very natural. And to me, it was a natural form of organizing. So now when Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a major sort of Black political figure, when she gives talks, she talks about the Tamil struggle as a part of international work, right? To me, this is a much more effective form of mobilizing than paying $100,000 to a conservative white Republican from Ohio. This is recognizing that there's a critical mass that's building outside of state structures, outside of the UN, right? And that mass is much more powerful at times than others. So it's not to say that the solidarity is not important. It is absolutely something we should be looking to, and I think the community has struggled with a lot, Like early on, my then husband and I tried to get the community to support Barack Obama, and we could have gotten him to come for, 20,000. Right? Nobody in the community would do it. They all backed Hillary. Right? So of course, the anti-Blackness in our community too is an issue. But I'm wary of this kind of politics. You know, we had a student in my program who joined this very dangerous organization called ADOS, African Descendants of Slavery. And their purpose is to figure out which Blacks deserve reparations and which don't, which genealogically is impossible. Impossible to disaggregate who came through the Caribbean, who came through, no, it's impossible to do. But for young people, it became to her this idea that, you know, ADOS was the most radical because they were asking for reparations, right? And so she came back into our program, which has had, of course, Black scholars, has had Cuban scholars, has had Mexican scholars. And said, everyone in this program is white presenting, myself included, in terms of their because they weren't Black, you know? And we had these very intense conversations where she would argue, well, this was just one genocide, the Tamils, no, like, you can't compare that to slavery. So this, you know, what I would say is that it consumes a lot of energy from people playing this sort of hierarchy of oppression. For me, my advice personally, what works for me as an individual is to pull back from all of this, the discussion of language, because your work should stand on its own. If you read my work carefully, if you read others' work carefully, it's very clear there's a politics there, right? And anyone else who's a deep thinker in an indigenous struggle, in, you know, anti-Black struggles, in anti-violence struggles, anywhere, should be able to read that politics and understand that this person exists in the same political sphere as I do. But the over-articulation, I think, you know, my sense is not only unnecessary, it leads to a lot of tension and fractures between movements that doesn't need to be there.
Thank you. We understand how the history of the Tamil struggle, as you've explained in your presentation, spoke of this solidarity even before we started having conversations like what the authentic form of solidarity would look like, if there is any. We received a question that asked about the times of Bala Anna, what solidarity between different struggles, when solidarity was between different struggles was a natural part of politics, and that dynamic has now changed. What do you think of the reason for that change now? And how do you see the history of solidarity during that time and during the example that you brought with Adele Balasingham, and the different people moving in through Bala Anna's apartment? How would you say that has changed, that idea of solidarity has changed in our present circumstances?
I think there's two things that happened. I think one was 9/11 and the rise of the security state and militarization. And the other was also identity politics, right? So with 9/11, with the rise in surveillance, I think at that time, there was an ability to, you know, to share information, to share struggles with each other without the fear of putting your cause at risk, no? So a lot of this to me is a question of political territory, right? There's this fear because what the state has left open for us to engage in is these little bits and scraps of political life, right? From marginalized community. So when there's only these little bits and scraps there, then everyone's fighting for that territory, right? Everybody wants that space, like in the conversation that happened with MIA and the Black artists in London. And the feeling is now that if I concede a little bit of my territory, right, to this other person, then I'm taking away from my struggle, rather than forming this kind of, you know, metaphorically landmass that could challenge the state. There is this idea of political territory, right? I think 9/11 was a big factor. I think it was one that maybe IACM underestimated for a time what that impact would be. I don't think any of us could have seen what that would have been. But the surveillance state and the way that the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which, you know, people don't always recognize, first stayed the same through Bush and Obama. Obama never touched the PTA. But second, that the language was shared, right, between India, and then from India it went to Sri Lanka, right? So the same language is across all of these states that are being used to pick up people for the white vans, for, you know, what's happening in the NYPD now. This is the same language, right? That if somebody is a threat to the state, you do not think about racism, sexism, any of that stuff, no? So when state violence coordinates like that, it's done in such a way as to break movements apart, right? Of course, we wouldn't be able to gather in the same way. Of course, you wouldn't be able to have conversations in the same way. So I think the surveillance was a big part of it. I do think the rise of identity politics also has become one of the more divisive things between some of these struggles. That being said, no, we don't hear about it. And maybe there's a third factor. The third factor is money, right? That the NGOs, the donors, the big white guys, 5 guys who fund everything, they were looking for more and more sort of edgy political work, right? So in doing that, what they've done is co-opted a number of the authentic political movements that were out there and turned them into NGOs, right? That they can control, that they can keep in a safe political space, right? Everything being done back then, those conversations with Balana, with others, there's no money involved. There's no money, like you sit around someone's house and somebody cooks and but you don't take outside money for that, right? One of the things that struck me with the Muzz that disappeared that I thought was so beautiful was when, Mario and I were there and they were organizing in a temple, and, of course, all these white women NGOs came and said, like, can we fund you for this, that, and the other? They said no, they didn't want it, right? When the journalists came and asked them to speak about their sons, they spoke about political violence. When the president came to talk to them, they said no. They said, what do we need the money for? Somebody comes to the temple and cooks every day. There's posters. Right? But real organizing doesn't actually take that much money. So I think these 3 things, the rise of a surveillance state of militarization, identity politics as it sort of started to play out, and the monetizing, of sort of cutting, as Arundhati Roy says, blunting the edges of political resistance with NGOization, right, of struggles, have limited our ability to sort of connect to each other. I mean, that being said, I have seen, just a year ago, Che's father was a part of a Pan-African movement building conference that happened outside of any NGO money, outside of any white money, where liberation movements were there. There was a meeting just 6 months ago of female fighters in North Africa that I was listening to from across North Africa and the Middle East. That people didn't know that much about, and they weren't, but the conversations are happening. For a number of reasons, they can't go public, largely the surveillance, but they're also, not funded, and we don't want them to be funded, because once they are, they become NGOized, right? And then there's no political life left in them.
Thank you. I think that it's so powerful to note how these conversations are happening outside of public view, and it's not necessarily something that doesn't exist in today's society. It's something that exists outside of our view for a very specific reason as well. We also received a question on Tamil female leadership in present-day circumstances, and how we can motivate Tamil women toward political leadership. How would you say that it's important to mobilize young Tamil women, whether it be in the diaspora or in the homeland, for leadership?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's perhaps changed since I had a kid, how I think about this. But I know for a fact that you can't always, you can't determine if your child is going to be a leader, right? There's personality, there's a number of things. So I think the most important thing always is to see your child as who they are, right? And to push every child to be a leader, it's not necessarily effective. I do think, though, that we're in a moment that we can support young women. When people ask me the goal of my work at City College and working with these young women, yes, I want them to have a political project. Yes, I want them to go out in the world with a political platform. But more important than that to me is that they don't feel crazy. That when they have these moments that are sexist, that are racist, that are whatever, there's somebody else they see this reciprocal recognition of that experience in somebody else, which is what I hope my writing does as well, simply so that you don't feel crazy. Because when you feel crazy, you feel alone in something. And when you feel alone, it's very difficult to mobilize, right? So I think, our parents did an excellent job of giving us community with all the flaws that it came with. But that community sort of, to me, when I went into a meeting with President Clinton or Samantha Powers or whatever, I felt that community behind me, you know? It wasn't me by myself there. I felt the strength of this community there, you know? So I think when you're working with young women, young boys, it's really about hearing them, right? I mean, my son asks me fascinating questions every day that changes my politics. It changes how I think about the world. So it's allowing them to be that individual. Of course, there's the bigger question of not pushing every bloody Tamil into being doctors and lawyers, no? But you know, this ability to see children, to see women, right? To see them in their entirety, to see their politics, to see their conversations, to see their struggles. That's what we have to do with young women. And as they get older, to make sure they grow up in community. That'll look different for my son than it will for others. But I moved to the Bronx so that my son grew up around people of color, so that he never felt he was the only brown person in the neighborhood, because I remember what that to me being the only brown person. No? So yeah, I think seeing these young women as who they are, right? I remember we gave in one of the Tamil conferences, myself and Dilo, a session on leadership, and it was one of the most powerful things that I've ever done, being able to talk to that many young Tamils. And this young woman, beautiful Sari, came up afterwards, and she said, "Can you tell him, my father, tell him to leave me alone about getting married?" She wanted to finish medical school. She wanted to, whatever. And I looked at him, I said, "Uncle, she's beautiful, she's smart, she's gonna get married. Leave her alone. If she doesn't want to choose right now, she will get married. Let it go." And he said, "Well, you can say that because you're married." And at that moment, you know, when my Appa was there and I was just newly divorced and worried about all of this cultural credibility falling apart, you know, being divorced, but I saw this young woman and I saw how, you know, alone she was, right? And so I told him, I said, "No, Uncle, I just got divorced." You know, and I saw my father cringe behind him. But you know, I think that is our role, to make sure that each of these young women feels that there's somebody else who's standing with her when she's in these moments, even if she's by herself.
Thank you. Yes, I resonated with that answer so much. Thank you. I think that a lot of people in our comments, at least, are saying that it's so important to not feel crazy as Tamil woman expressing your political identity to your community, and also finding ways to assert your lived experiences in history in a way that doesn't like exhaust you or make you feel alone. Spaces like this and having heard your presentation has definitely, I feel like I can speak on behalf of the several people that are putting it in the comments, made us feel less crazy as well, for lack of better terms. So thank you. We had a more contextual question that's based on like Toronto Tamil organizing, and it's a bit long, apologies, but someone had posed a question about the Provincial Genocide Act, as Tamils have been fighting to ensure students across the province of Ontario will learn about Tamil genocide, with Canada having over 300,000 Tamils living here. We've had to fight back against the Sri Lankan consulate that's challenging school boards, local school boards, and attempting to silence them for acknowledging the genocide. And the school boards have stood strong against the Sri Lankan consulate. What other tactics do you think that we can expect from the Sri Lankan state in trying to deny justice for genocide, and the work that diaspora activists do?
Well, you can expect all the tactics from the Sri Lankan state, but I think maybe it's a good moment to emphasize that, you know, this work can be dangerous. It's not always going to be easy. You know, like my and Appa were very unhappy when I started going back to Sri Lanka. You know, and I'm going to say I'm going to be up all night until you come back. You know, lots of Tamil guilt and all that. But the reality is that it is dangerous. It's less dangerous for us in the diaspora, of course. But when we go back to the island, we put other people at risk, right? So the first thing I would say is, in the political work you're doing in Canada, which I have followed, what's happening with the school board, is to consider, as we talked about your role in the struggle, if that includes work back on the island, one should be careful there, no? In terms of a public association with things. And this is, again, I think, where this tendency to engage in performative branding of your social justice rather than doing the work can also limit your ability to do, you know, work over a lifetime, right? This is just one moment. So if you decided to go public in the struggle, which I think is an important one, just be cautious that this is not necessarily going to be, it won't be as easy for you to go back to the island, right? They are watching all of these things happening in the diaspora. I did a case in London a few years ago of all of the asylum cases of people who returned voluntarily from London who had been involved in protests, you know, but had originally lived on the island. And there were several that were picked up and tortured from the diaspora, right? So in terms of the tactics of the state, never ever underestimate the Sri Lankan state and what they will do to get to Tamils, right? It's terrifying, right? They know everything that's happening. They're watching everything that's happening. It is still an important struggle. The language of genocide is one that I haven't used in the United States, but for a very particular reason. It's not because I don't think what happened to the Tamils was a genocide. It absolutely was a genocide. But what I found is when I was working with policymakers at that time in the State Department and the UN and otherwise, is when you said genocide, it shut down the conversation. Right? People associated with Palestine, they're worried about their constituents. They associated it with Darfur. It was just too heavy, right? And even instrumentally, what I found was that, you know, those countries, if you look at the ones that have actually been called genocide, the context for those populations under those states has generally gotten worse as soon as this language emerges on the outside. Not to say it shouldn't be done. I've made the choice because of my positioning, not to publicly use that word out of simply political strategy, right? Not to. The Sri Lankan state is always watching. And they're not, the thing is, after years and years and years of not being accountable, they don't believe that anything will happen to them. Right? And that means that they don't care if they do anything to you. I mean, there was moments in 2010 when I was researching the rape of women after the war, and I was in these hostels in Vavranya and other places, and all of a sudden I realized, you know, like I'm researching exactly what happened to these Tamil women in these hostels by themselves, and I'm sitting here by myself in this hostel, you know. So I think, you know, I want to definitely put out there that don't ever underestimate what they'll do to you, what they'll do to your family, what they'll do. You know, I don't take my son back now that this guy's back. I used to, but because I don't know what they would do. So it's an important fight, it absolutely is, but just take it in consideration of what you will see your positioning to be going forward and whether you plan to go back to the island. Point about in that session, he said, "You're going to stay with me." I believe in my culture and I want to be a part of it, but I also want to be an individual. But I feel that I can't do that without losing my culture. And it really struck me because your culture is inside of you. Nobody can take that away from you, regardless of what you say, your political opinion, like that's not something that anybody can take. So do your work, be an individual, do your political work, but don't be afraid that the culture can be taken from you. It lives inside all of us.
I think that's an excellent way to answer a lot of questions we had about finding our role, unique role within the Tamil struggle. Sorry?
No, sorry, my son.
Sorry. And I think that's a great place to really leave a lot of us off after this very engaging and very informative presentation. Thank you so much again, Dr. Gowrinathan, for sitting with us today and also for going over 30 minutes. So sorry about that. Thank you for sitting with us and thank you for walking us through such an important conversation and answering the questions that a lot of us had today. We really appreciate having you on for our first specialized session, and we hope that everyone can join for the next few sessions. Yeah, I think that's a great place to end off. I'm not sure if you can see Dr. Gowrinathan, but everyone's very grateful for your presence here today. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone. So yeah, we will send out details for our next session in the upcoming days. This will be recorded and published onto YouTube, and we will send out the link for that as well. So thank you so much, and hope to see you soon. Bye.
Bye from me and Cho.